civilization, I suggest, developed out of shamanism in the Ice Age that went a rather different way, or a slightly different way, from other shamanistic cultures. Those same tools, those same scientific tools of shamanism led them to discoveries and explorations that perhaps other shamanistic cultures did not reach. But I've often been taken out of context in this. I have said on the record a number of times that they had, I think, a technology equivalent to ours in the 19th or even the 18th century. And this is taken to assume that I'm saying that they maybe had steam engines or the kind of rudimentary but machine tech that we had in the 18th and 19th centuries. And actually, that's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm just talking about the results of what I see. And the two particular key points for me are ancient knowledge of longitude. How do I know about this? Because there is a fascinating category of maps that have been preserved and passed down. And in every case, the maps we're looking at were maps that were drawn in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, but they were based on older source maps. And the map makers will often tell us that. Piri Reis map was based on more than 25 source maps. And Admiral Piri Reis, who drew that map, of which only a fraction now survives, but on that fraction he states in his own handwriting that it is based not only on explorations in his time, but also on maps that go back to the time of Alexander the Great. He's referring to there's the Piri Reis map. On the left we have South America, the east coast of South America, and on the right we have the east coast of West Africa. The west coast of Africa. And then when you go down to the bottom of the Piri Reis map, you're finding a representation of Antarctica at a time when sea levels were lower and the Antarctic continent was much larger and was joined to South America. But what's interesting about these maps is not only that they are based on copies of older source maps, but that they incorporate extremely accurate relative longitudes. And that is a mystery, because our high-tech civilization didn't crack the longitude problem until the mid-18th century. Before that, it was all done by dead reckoning. Navigators had no idea really where they were. They could be 300 or 400 miles east or west of a particular point, and they wouldn't know it. Longitude, once you've got that worked out, and in the case of our civilization, that involved a chronometer that could keep accurate time at sea. Once you've got that worked out, you can know exactly where you are. So to find accurate longitudes on maps that were drawn themselves hundreds of years before we'd cracked the longitude problem, and that are based on lost source maps that may go back to the time of the Lost Library of Alexandria and even before. That's very interesting, and it's very hard to explain. And also on these same maps, it's not shown so clearly on the Piri Reis map, but it is shown on the Orontius Phineas map. The presence of Antarctica is puzzling. Honest maps based on knowledge of seafarers in the 1800s and not drawing on older source maps. To me, this is an intriguing mystery because this map is drawn in the 1530s. The legend in Latin at the bottom tells us that he is revealing to us parts of the world that had hitherto been hidden in darkness, and those include Antarctica. And this is a problem because our civilization didn't discover Antarctica until 1820. But there it is on these old maps, based on when he says hidden in darkness, I'm taking him to refer to archives of older maps that were there. So at the tip of South America, we have Antarctica, and it's also at the tip of South Africa. It's exactly in the right place, a bit bigger than it is today. But there it is. So this speaks to me not only of a culture that had understood how to calculate longitude accurately, but that also explored the world and mapped the world long before we ourselves were able to do so. And then the other aspect that I focus on, and again, this does not require machine technology. It does not require us to it doesn't require a lost civilization to look like our civilization looked in the 18th or 19th century, is highly sophisticated knowledge of astronomy. This is another thing that we can just track back further and further and further in time, and particularly knowledge of a rather hard to observe phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. Now, mainstream archaeology, I'm going to keep using that word because they don't like the word mainstream, because it's just archaeology. They own it all. There's no such thing as alternative archaeology. We don't exist. We're just annoying.
Right.
You know. The hard to observe phenomenon of precession of the equinoxes, mainstream archaeology attributes that to the Greeks, possibly to the Babylonians, but generally it's put back to around 300 BC, about 2,300 years ago. A couple of Greek astronomers figured out that the pole star was very gradually changing in the sky. It was no longer the pole star, that the stars that rose behind the sun, the zodiacal constellations that lie on the path of the sun, that these were gradually shifting. And it was understood that this was a process that took place at roughly the rate of 1 degree every 72 years, a very slow process. So the whole cycle of precession will take just under 26,000 years to complete before the constellation that housed the sun at dawn on the spring equinox returns to do that same job again. And this requires very detailed record keeping and very long observation. I don't know whether the ancients understood that precession is an observation that is caused by a wobble on the axis of the Earth. The Earth is our viewing platform. We see the skies from that viewing platform. A wobble on that platform, even if it's very, very slow, will, over a long period of time, change the position of everything in the sky. Most notable in the case of the pole star, which in our case is Polaris, but was not Polaris in the past. That sometimes the extended north pole of the Earth pointed at empty space. At other times it's pointed at other stars. And it won't always point at Polaris because the Earth is doing this. And the same with the constellations of the zodiac, and particularly the marker of the spring equinox, 21st of March in the northern hemisphere, that rise behind the sun. So in other words, if you're looking at the horizon an hour before dawn on the spring equinox, you're going to see a constellation lying on the horizon, just above the horizon. And then as the sun rises, you'll see that it's rising into exactly the place that was occupied by that constellation. And that constellation was considered to define the character of a world age. And again, mainstream archaeology rejects any notion that there was any knowledge of the constellations of the zodiac prior to about 2,000 or 2,300 years ago. And that's always seemed to me absurd, because the ancients, not just my proposed lost civilization, but all ancient cultures, were very focused on the stars, very focused on the sky. It was an ever-present reality to them. And it's really hard to miss the zodiacal constellations and their relationship to the sun if you are a culture that is observing the stars constantly. It's very hard to miss it. So I think it's actually pouring scorn on the achievements of the ancients to imagine that they didn't recognize the zodiacal constellations. They may have defined them, they may not have called them the same thing we do. They may have depicted them symbolically slightly differently from the way that we do, but those constellations, I believe, have been recognized for tens of thousands of years. And there's evidence, for example, for the recognizing of the constellation of Taurus in Lascaux Cave in France, in the cave art in France. You find the stars of the Pleiades on the shoulder of the bull, exactly where they should be. And what drew me to this, and I'd like to share this with your listeners and viewers, what drew me to this is a very hard-to-read book, but an extremely interesting book called Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana, who was professor of the history of science at MIT, and Hertha von Deschend, who was professor of the history of science at Frankfurt University. Major mainstream academics. And they published this book in the 1960s when academia, particularly archaeology, was perhaps less controlling about the narrative of the past than it is today. And the bottom line of that extraordinary book is that the notion that the Greeks discovered precession is complete rubbish. And they present evidence for that notion going far, far back into the past. And it's combined with a series of numbers which relate to the rate of change caused by precession, 1 degree every 72 years. So 43,200 is 72 times 600. 432,000, which is the number of syllables in the Rig Veda, is a multiple of 72. There's a numbers game being played in ancient myths and traditions, and at the heart of them is the number 72. But numbers that are related to it, like 108, which is 72 plus 36 is 108. Divide that by 2, you get 54. According to the work done by Santillana and von Deschen, these are all speaking about precession when these numbers are there. And at the same time, it's combined with particular imagery of a whirling, churning process taking place. In India, they call it the churning of the Milky Ocean, where you see the serpent Vasuki wrapped around Mount Mandara, and you see figures of gods on one side holding onto one part of Vasuki and figures of demons on the other holding on to the other part of Vasuki, and there's an image of it, and churning the Milky Ocean, this churning, whirling process. Interestingly, the purpose of churning the Milky Ocean is to produce Amrita, the elixir of immortality, which is interesting in itself. In ancient Egypt, you have imagery of the god Horus and the god Set, again a deity, a good deity and a bad deity. Set was always regarded as a negative figure, standing on either side of what looks like a kind of drill, and they're rotating it in the same sort of way. And Hamlet's mill is the same idea, comes from ancient Norse mythology, Lodi's mill, about this whirling, churning whirlpool in the ocean. It's essentially the same idea. So the combination of this imagery of a churn turning in the heavens and of a series of numbers that are related to the precession of the equinoxes convinces them, plus much other evidence, which I've also shared in my books, that there was a very ancient knowledge of precession, which they attribute to what they call some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization. They don't pin down when that ancestor civilization existed, but they suggest that it passed down a legacy of knowledge to many other cultures around the world. And that's really actually one of the key issues, one of the key books that set me on my own quest to look, where did this knowledge come from? Where did this information come from? So I'm more talking about what we can know, is that there was knowledge of longitude, there was knowledge of parts of the world that we didn't discover until the 1820s, and there was a highly sophisticated knowledge of astronomy based on long-term observation and record keeping, that these things are present in the ancient past, even though archaeologists may choose to ignore them. And what is the best explanation for those? And I do think that the best explanation, I do not claim that I've proved it, but I do think that the best explanation is a forgotten episode in the human past, a lost civilization which had solved these problems, and which then passed these ideas down to later cultures all around the world. And this is one of the things that annoys archaeologists. They say that I'm taking credit away from those other cultures all around the world because this idea was diffused to them by the survivors of a lost civilization. It always strikes me as deeply hypocritical, actually, because archaeologists, and again, American archaeologists, are very much in the lead on this. They're very strongly against the idea of dissemination. The present model is that every culture around the world completely invented itself without any contact or influence from any other culture around the world. The only exception they make is in Europe. In the case of Europe, archaeologists are fully agreed that Europeans didn't have a clue about farming until around about 6,000 years ago, and that they only learnt about farming because farmers from Turkey, from Anatolia, migrated into Western Europe and taught them how to farm. So somehow the notion that information, ideas, skills can be disseminated from one culture to another are perfectly acceptable when they're being disseminated from Southwest Asia to Western Europe, but are not acceptable in any other direction.